We used to believe that democracy began with ancient Athens. Now we believe that it is as old as humanity. We also know that it doesn't last, and that the dictatorships that replace it lead to brutality and civil collapse. Is there a way out of this cycle? Many are trying to find it.
The reason why the spatial model of democracy, which we talked about in the last video, crashed and burned so fast was because of dramatic changes in survey research in the 1950s and 60s. Advances in survey research, political psychology, and social choice theory had reached a point that there were multiple studies going on all the time about aspects of democracy that had until then only been the speculation of political philosophers pontificating from their smoking rooms. Social research was becoming empirical. It was becoming a full-on science. Some studies drew cheerful conclusions about democracies, but most of these conclusions seemed forced and didn't always seem to follow from the results of the studies. The best quality studies that have been quoted ever since were more nuanced. It was becoming clear that how voters made their decisions and how they determined their vote was rather mysterious, but however it was done, it certainly did not follow any of the old theories. A seminal book suggesting a new theory was published posthumously by a V.O. Key Jr. in 1966. It had an opening statement that suggested by its denial what most scholars were beginning to wonder. The perverse and unorthodox argument of this little book is that voters are not fools. Key's theory was that voters act on retrospective judgment. They may not understand the policy issues of the day, and they may not understand who is responsible for it, but they do know if they're happy, and they know who is currently in office. It has gone by several names over the years, but for our purposes, we will refer to it as a retrospective theory of democracy. The theory is as follows. The rationally ignorant voter may not know any of the details, and they may not have any clear ideological beliefs, but they can feel the results of recent policy in their pocketbook. They may not understand the foreign policy decisions that preceded it, but they know whether their children are at risk of being killed in a new war. They may not be aware of the state of the security apparatus or the decisions that resulted in it, but they know whether they no longer feel safe walking in the streets in the evening. They know if their taxes are suddenly higher or if they have lost their job. If they are feeling good about the state of the nation, they are likely to vote to keep the incumbents in power. And if they feel like the country is going in the wrong direction, they're likely to vote for the party that is in opposition. In this manner, democracy plays a self-correcting mechanism to incompetent government and a reinforcing mechanism to good governance. The theory has been very compelling in that it is clear that the mass answer to the question, is the country going in the right direction or the wrong direction, very often predicts the results of elections. There is overwhelming evidence that rationally ignorant voters do indeed vote in retrospective judgment. So what exactly have surveyors found? There is tons of evidence that voters vote retrospectively, but the idea that this punishes incompetence and rewards good government is not clear at all. In fact, there is good evidence that retroactive voting may encourage bad governance and government that is not in the interest of the people. Let's just take an extreme case from ancient history. In ancient Egypt, the pharaoh was a god who would make the Nile flood every year. When floods didn't happen, as in drought years, they sometimes overthrew or even killed the pharaoh and had it replaced with a new pharaoh better able to cause the flooding. Thinking in terms of causality is a normal function of the human brain, but in pre-scientific minds, cause and effect were typically imaginary. There are countless examples of this in history where natural phenomena like earthquakes, famine, pandemics, and the like were attributed to God's anger or to the machinations of evil human actors and had real effects on the political structure. The rationally ignorant voter also thinks in terms of causality, but has little understanding of cause and effect in the economic or geopolitical realm. And without that information, their thinking is more in line with pre-scientific thinking. The authors of Democracy for Realists did a statistical analysis of election results in New Jersey in 1916 after a series of unprecedented shark attacks. They found that in the coastal regions where the attacks happened and impacted the local economy, voters punished the incumbent presidential candidate by slightly over 3%. 3% doesn't sound like much, but most elections would be overturned by a 3% swing in vote. Even more surprising is that in the actual beach communities most impacted, voting shifted against the president by 13.3%. The authors didn't stop there. In further studies, they found that minor droughts or floods caused a drop in support for incumbents to be 0.7%, and major droughts and floods caused a drop of 1.5%. The election of George W. Bush instead of Al Gore in the year 2000, they show, was attributable to extreme weather in multiple states. Applying their findings to the 2000 election, the authors determined that Gore would have won an additional 2.8 million votes in 7 additional states, including Florida, if weather had not been so extreme, easily winning Gore the presidency. The argument that voters are punishing the government maybe for not having made better provisions for extreme circumstances, like putting in better protections for bathers from sharks or to improve farmers' financial positions during extreme weather, is a reasonable one, but one that doesn't hold water. In the case of Gore versus Bush, ironically, Gore was the one with a platform that took climate issues seriously, while Bush, the winner of the election, chose to assume we couldn't do anything about it. Without a rational basis for their voting patterns, voters are essentially kicking the dog after a bad day at the office. As far back as the 1850s, statesmen had been blaming electoral defeat on economic depressions and crop failures. Multiple books have been published since Key's book supporting his research, all of them demonstrating that voters that switch parties usually have retrospective reasons for doing so, typically regarding their personal financial situation. Analysis as to whether those reasons were even remotely rational were rarely made. "It's the economy, stupid," was coined by James Carville for the successful Bill Clinton campaign against President Bush Sr. Bush Sr. had been immensely popular due to the Gulf War a year before the election. Unfortunately for Bush, a recession hit the next year, which Clinton leveraged, turning Bush's approval from a sky-high 90% approval to a dismal 64% disapproval. Studies have indeed demonstrated that around half of voters switching parties in the 20th century can be attributed to financial considerations. Okay, we are finally getting some answers as to how democracy works, but it brings up a host of new questions. For example, can good government be secured by the electoral version of driving using the rearview mirror? And if voters vote their moods, what besides the economy influences elections? For that matter, does the president really control the economy? Let's look at whether the president controls the economy first. In the United States, a president shares control over fiscal policy with the legislature. Monetary policy is handled entirely by the Federal Reserve. Fiscal policy, trade policy, the policies regarding tax rates, education reform, maintenance of infrastructure, all have a profound impact on the future state of the economy, but typically after a large lag, counted in years, not months. Only a few fiscal techniques like helicopter money have rapid impacts on the economy. Unfortunately, studies have shown that the rationally ignorant voter is mostly impacted by their sense of well-being in the 3 months before an election. A 3-month period tells you only what business cycle you're in, not the general state of the economy. The Federal Reserve is responsible for moderating the business cycle swings. In essence, voting for or against the incumbent because of the economy is to misunderstand entirely who is controlling what. And as to the question, can good government be secured by driving using the rearview mirror? There is a cautionary tale here. There are plenty autocratic states with democratic facades that understand this principle well. States like Russia and Venezuela, where monetary policy and fiscal policy are firmly in the hands of the dear leader, routinely jack up monetary and fiscal policy in the short periods before elections to ensure that the economy is booming for the 3 months prior to an election. After the election, they have to try to tamp down the resulting inflation. It makes for an unhealthy economy, where businesses have to deal with constant political disruption, bouts of inflation, and then post-inflation austerity. But it is politically effective, and as a result, it's heavily used. The US president does not control the economy, and thank God for that. A good economy comes from a well-educated workforce, a solid infrastructure, and a smart but limited regulation. These are factors that have impacts years after policy implementation, and the rationally ignorant have limited understanding of them. Bad business cycles, the type that influence elections, come from clumsy monetary policy. For example, keeping the interest rates very low, even as massive helicopter money was put into the economy after the pandemic, as well as external shocks, like OPEC deciding to restrict oil production, and then internal shocks, like the pandemic. The president has little influence over these, yet this is primarily what influences voters. And as to our other question, what besides the economy influences voters, it turns out there's a host of things. One study showed that voters give 1.6% increased vote for the incumbent if their favorite local sports team wins. Less directly related, but relevant nonetheless, is the fact that people are more likely to support welfare before lunch than after lunch. Clearly, political opinions by the uninformed can be very transient and based on very immediate sensations or emotions. Additionally, rationally ignorant voters seem rather easy to convince that a solid economy is actually tottering on the edge of a precipice. When partisan media tell their viewers that the economy is near collapse, it has a profound impact on a large segment of the voting populace, even if the economy is strong and healthy. In the final analysis, retrospective accountability is the closest we've come to describing how democracy works in most countries, but it clearly cannot enforce good government. Good government is what politicians provide if they are capable and wish to do so. Winning elections is an entirely different skill and seems largely unrelated to governance, good or bad. In the next video, we are going to add more nuance so that we get a more complete picture. We're going to talk about political psychology. I hope to see you there.